Welcome to the Science for the Public lecture series. Science for the Public is an organization committed to bringing science information and issues to the general public. Visit our website for our program listings and blog.
Good evening and welcome to this evening of popular science presentations. I must thank Ivan Stapp for having given me such a kind introduction. And what I noticed that what she talked about my work during this introduction, which began with the differences between malignant cells and normal cells, went on to talk about work on cataract of the human eye, and then now modeling of what happens when carcinogens attack DNA. For the career of any professional biologist in this era, it probably will follow a train very similar to this, passing through almost nothing other than damage, and which is why your system needs to have defense to cope with the damage, and that will be the subject of my talk today. Normally when you think in terms of defense, we think in terms of organisms. We say he is ill or she is ill, and we imply that the whole organism is operating against external threat. However, the focus of my talk will be what happens at the level of the most smallest unit of biological systems, the cell. To give you a review of this, I'll first start with the large scale level of defense that I just mentioned. As an example, pardon my bad throat, the example has to do with respiratory tract and what happens when we have to defend it from bacteria, viruses, and so on, which make their way in breath. We have multiple layers of defense here. First, there is mucus, which lines your pharynx and the nasal tract, which can literally trap any incoming bacteria and so on by its sticky nature. Then we have the epithelium, which has a second line of defense. It produces antimicrobial peptides. These are secretions which attack the wall, the membrane of bacteria, and break the bacteria's membrane down. Then third level, we have phagocytes. These are large cells of the innate immune system, which literally engulf the bacterium. They swallow it, and then once it has been swallowed, they kind of use a burst of oxidative radicals to digest the bacterium. And if anything persists, if it goes beyond all this, then we have the adaptive immunity, the one which is part of your circulatory system, and which is what we normally think of when we speak of the immune system, and that is the adaptive immune system that has a memory of having encountered foreign bodies before and then launches an attack to wipe them out. So this is how organisms work. How do cells do it? Because cells are part of a larger organism, and the organism has its own abilities for defense, which I just talked about. What do cells need defense for in their individual capacity? For this, I have put up a brief description of what are the various factors which go into our cellular defense mechanisms. One is the ability to acquire nutrition. Every cell needs to get its supply of food, and that has to remain unbroken for it to survive. It has to produce energy using the nutrition which has acquired. It has to maintain homeostasis, which means it has to maintain a balance so that nothing changes, everything remains as constant as is possible. And finally, it has to be able to divide, which is it should be able to use its genetic material to make its progeny, because that is the definition of biology, the ability to replicate. But what happens in real life? Nutrients enter the cell, but then you also have toxins coming in from outside. Same goes for energy, which can be poisoned by free radicals. The process of creating energy itself produces free radicals, which is something which I'll come to soon. And then the homeostasis, which is an attempt to make the environment constant, is always subject to threat. You can have fluctuations all the time. And same thing with DNA. It should be stable. We like to think of it as the blueprint of life, which has to be stable, but it keeps mutating at a very high rate. Measure of this comes to about 800 lesions of DNA per hour per cell in your body. This is when you're not standing in the sun. That's a lot of DNA to take care of, a lot of damaged DNA to take care of. So my talk will today focus to some extent on how we handle the damage to DNA that happens spontaneously as well as from external agents over a period of time. This illustration tells you the chemistry of DNA. It's very simple and most of you are probably familiar with it. DNA has just 4 alphabets, what we call as the DNA bases A, T, G, and C. And these bases have peculiarities. They form complementary pairs, that is, A can only pair with T and G pairs with C, and together they go to make double helical structures, which I'll come to. Sometimes a few of these bases are modified. One very common example is C gets converted to methyl C by the addition of the small little piece of 4 atoms here. About 1% of the DNA in our body is in this methyl C form. The GC pairs are much more adhesive than the AT pairs because they are linked to each other by 3 hydrogen bonds as compared to the AT pair, which has 2 hydrogen bonds. And these 2 pairs are not distributed equally in the genome. The AT pairs are present in fragile sites, which seems obvious from the fact that they have fewer connections, whereas GC-rich regions called CPG islands are found near genes which need to be kept silenced. That is, the genome tries to ensure that the DNA remains closed and not open. Complementary base pairs form stacks, which I have tried to illustrate here, and these stacks wind around each other to form the double helix of DNA. This is a head-on view showing that it's like really a spiral which is going all the way up. DNA should be constant, as I said earlier at the beginning of this talk, but it is not. It undergoes changes, and the changes can be either on a very large scale or on a very small scale. On a large scale, you have a phenomenon called transposition. What I am showing here is the same double helix, but presented in a linear form. And in a transposon, a piece of the DNA is taken from one chromosome and goes to the next one. This is a very large scale, and this piece of DNA which is taken out can be carrying genes or can have disruptions in genes which can lead to some diseases associated with this kind of jumping of genes. They include hemophilia A and B and a predisposition to certain cancers. The jumping genes are also found in plants where they are responsible for a lot of variation that is generated between different varieties, as we see in agriculture and so on. Second mode of transfer of genes that happens on a large scale is horizontal gene transfer, and this happens only between different organisms. As you can see, a piece of DNA has gone over from here to here. Artificially doing horizontal gene transfer is what we call genetic engineering, and that's a subject of much debate today because there is some fear that this kind of jumping of genes from one organism to the another one could also be happening in larger animals, not just in bacteria. Small scale changes. I have tried to use English language as a means of trying to make a point about what kind of changes can take place in DNA and what their consequences can be. The alphabet I've used here is a 4-letter set, but in life, in DNA, it's based on triplets, which is 3. I could not construct a long enough sentence composed only of 3-letter words, so forgive me for this one here. What you can see is that you have insertions, substitutions, where one alphabet is changed for another one, deletions, and because the structure of DNA is linear and runs in the form of sentences, which is what we call genes, any process such as insertion and substitution can lead to a frame shift, which means that after the point of the substitution, everything becomes garbled and you cannot make sense of it. Frame shift mutations is what such changes are called in DNA, and they can be quite deleterious. Now, if you are trying to copy something of this scale, DNA is a very large molecule. The human body has 6 billion base pairs of DNA, and you would expect that any mechanism which is trying to replicate it could make errors at a certain rate. 1% is to be human. I suppose we could say that a 1% error is very human, but it's not an affordable error in the case of living systems. In the bacterium E. coli, for example, it has been shown that it's between 1 and 10 million. That's the rate at which errors happen in replication. That means that the machinery which undertakes the process of replicating DNA shows high fidelity and has excellent proofreading properties. Because the replication machinery is very good, it follows that we have to worry about how do we get changes, errors in DNA. They can only be caused by extrinsic means, not by the machinery itself, or at least not very often by the machinery itself. And this is due to chemical changes which take place in the DNA, chemical changes which are imposed upon it by external factors, the kind of thing that the cell has to fight against. One example which has been very well studied, very well documented, and all of us know quite a bit about is the case of polyaromatic hydrocarbons. These are molecules which have been implicated in cancers. They are the very definition of environmental carcinogens. One example which I have illustrated here is a derivative of anthracene. Anthracene is a kind of compound that is very commonly found in coal tar derivatives. You find it in smoke and so on. And the reason why it succeeds at what it does is because it structurally is a close mimic of the structure of a DNA base pair. You can see the base pair overlaid or rather underlaid under the anthracene molecule, and the fit is the reason why it works so well as a disruptor of DNA. You can see it here in the actual case of a DNA double strand. The insertion of or the intercalation, which is the word which is used scientifically, of anthracene into DNA leads to a major disruption in the order of the structure of DNA. The same thing in a solid diagram. This is a way of representing the actual atomic volumes of the atoms of DNA. You can see that the anthracene has caused a disruption here. Okay. Similarly, another famous example is benzo-A-pyrene, which is found in smoke, is found in burnt foods, and is a well-known environmental carcinogen. It was the first carcinogen to be studied, first detected or first implied to be a carcinogen way back in the year 1775 by Sir Percival Pott, who showed that chimney sweeps were more prone to get skin cancers because they were constantly exposed to something in the coal tar which was lining the chimneys of London. These intercalators, as the diagram shows you, cause bends in DNA, they disrupt the packaging of DNA, and therefore are likely to induce replicating machinery to make errors. I had shown you an illustration of how an adduct of a carcinogen or carcinogen-like substance can cause disruptions in DNA, but that is not true always. The benzpyrene, which I just showed you in the previous example, which was causing a major disruption, can sometimes find its way and very neatly pack itself into the structure of DNA. You can see it over there. It's not much in terms of disrupting the order of the DNA. But then, at any time, this can switch back to the earlier and more disruptive form. Besides chemicals, you can also have physical agents which can cause damage to DNA. A famous example is UV light. We hear a lot about exposure to the sun being harmful to you and so on. This is because UV light, when it interacts with the basis of DNA, forms thymine dimers. When you have two T's adjacent to each other in the sequence of DNA, they kind of link up together covalently to form a kink. The kink leads to a distinct bending in the shape of DNA, as you can see here. And damages of this sort can have serious consequences when DNA has to go and face the replicative machinery. The replication machinery, which is dividing the DNA, comes to a point where there's a kink and halts there. It can no longer go further because there is a disruption of the kind I've shown here. It can make errors like deletions. It can assume that there is one base missing here and read through, leading to the frame shift mutation that I talked about. Or it can just stop, and if it stops, the cell at some point after a certain molecular clock has decided that enough time has been spent on trying to correct this damage, the cell is kind of destined for programmed cell death. It has to be eliminated. On a large scale in chromosomes also, you can see that double-stranded breaks can form very distinct, this is after exposure to UV light, breaks. The most common form of damage to DNA, however, is not exposure to environmental carcinogens. That happens too, as does exposure to light, which cannot be avoided, but it's damaged by free radicals, which attack the basis of DNA in very subtle ways, cause small changes at the level of the molecule, but large changes in terms of the effect they have on it. What I have shown here is how one atom here, this was a hydrogen, it has been changed to an oxygen by the action of an oxidative free radical. The oxygen causes a disruption, so that opposite it, it's now finding itself with an A, not a G opposite C, but an A, which is a serious error. This is an error which is destined to become a mutation, because when this copy of DNA next copies itself, it will match up with T. So what you have done is you have taken a G and made it into a T in the course of replication of DNA. I'll change gears now and try to tell you about how the oxidative damage, which I just showed you, happens. These are cartoon illustrations. You must pardon my abilities at drawing. But the point I'm trying to make is that some species, like oxygen, have a tendency to react with other atomic species, and this is because of the way their chemistry and their physical chemistry is. An atom of oxygen has 6 shells in its outermost electron. Those of you who remember their high school chemistry will remember that 8 is what makes a good configuration. When you have 8, you have neon. Of course, this has 8 protons and 8 electrons, so it is neon. What oxygen is trying to do is achieve that configuration of 8 shells in its outermost electron. One way it can do this is by sharing 2 electrons of each. This is a tricky proposition. It's like trying to share a rather small blanket. Not quite satisfactory, but a little tug here and a little tug there you can manage. And that's how O2, the oxygen molecule, remains stable for fairly long periods of time. But sometimes that is not what an oxygen finds. It may find itself next to a hydrogen or to some other atomic entity, and then what can happen is as follows. If it is just one hydrogen and one oxygen, it can form a hydroxyl radical. This is a free radical, an oxidative species, because it has 7 and not 8. It's not a satisfactory arrangement either for the hydrogen, which would prefer 2, or for the oxygen, which would prefer 8. So this results in an unstable radical, the hydroxyl radical. Similarly, if it finds 2 atoms of hydrogen and 2 of oxygen come together, you will have a condition where they have sort of achieved an imaginary set of 6 electrons each for the 2 oxygen atoms, but remains a relatively unstable species. Not as unstable as hydroxyl, certainly not as unstable as a singlet oxygen atom, but then unstable in its own way. If there are 2 of hydrogen and 1 of water, you have a balance, a relatively stable molecule, water. You can see that the shells are now correctly occupied as far as oxygen is concerned. So this is the chemistry behind free radicals and how our system copes with them. Reactive oxygen species are found inside the cell and outside the cell. Outside the cell, they are generally produced by the radiolysis of water when electromagnetic waves or ionizing radiation of various high energy wavelengths happens to interact with the water molecule. It causes some breakdown to produce the kind of radicals which I had just shown to you all. These ionizing radiations include alpha particles, beta particles, neutrons, cosmic rays, and so on. Their effectiveness depends on the relative energies of these and the relative penetrating power. Visible light is not a very good source of ionizing radiation, nor are radio waves and microwaves, even though there are fears that they may have other effects. Similarly, electromagnetic waves, especially high energy photons and ultraviolet light, are strong sources of production of the ROS species. This is a symbol which is now being used to denote danger to the human body from sources of electromagnetic or ionizing radiation. You will find this on devices like food irradiators and so on. Inside the cell, now we had said that the whole purpose of trying to maintain an integral membrane and components inside the cell are to ensure that we exclude out all possible means that could cause damage inside. But then how do they find their way in is what the next few slides will try to illustrate. When the planet Earth was formed, it is speculated that we started off with a very reducing atmospheres which slowly turned oxidative over a period of time. Biological systems, however, are within themselves highly reducing and therefore rich in electrons, whereas the outside world, that is the atmosphere around us, is poor in electrons. The species which form when you kind of let the rich man talk to the poor man or vice versa is what free radical chemistry is all about. One major source of production of free radicals in the body is the process by which we generate energy. This is the proton pump, usually confined to the mitochondria in high organisms. And the proton pump, which is actually called by many people to be the greatest thing that ever happened since the Big Bang, is the basis of life in the sense that it is what takes all chemical forms of matter and converts them into a form of energy which can be utilized by the system. The pump involves the taking in of protons, cycling of ADP to ATP, ATP being like the currency of energy inside the cell, and then the elimination of protons out by another pathway, during which oxygen is converted to water. This is essentially aerobic respiration. You are taking oxygen, you are taking reduced forms of matter and converting them into energy and water. But all is not foolproof here. In theory, you should take one glucose atom and one oxygen atom to give you 6 molecules of carbon dioxide and 6 of water. And the energy yield, the estimated theoretical maximal energy yield is 38 ATP molecules for every glucose molecule which is metabolized. What you see is, however, much less. It's around 30 ATP, 28 if you are lazy. This is because some of the protons kind of leak backwards. They don't remain there. So when the chain has brought the electron to the oxygen, there's no hydrogen for it to interact with and form water. It is left holding the extra electron, and therefore the formation of a reactive oxygen species happens. Another reaction by which this happens is called the Fenton reaction. This involves iron in its ferrous, the oxidized and ferric forms, and in this chain you can see that you generate hydroxyl radicals along with other species. The strange thing about the Fenton reaction is that it's a cyclic reaction. That is, you convert ferrous to ferric and then ferric goes back to ferrous. So you are perpetuating a chain reaction which produces a large number of hydroxyl radicals. How does the system cope with all this now? Will be the subject of this part of my talk. How does cell defense happen against all this radiation and ions and carcinogens and what have you? One thing is DNA has redundant information content. First of all, it has 2 strands. Those 2 strands are like copies of each other in a way, and therefore they carry information twice over. Very often in eukaryotes, you have twice the number of chromosomes too. So you have information like overload over and over here. But that's not enough. You also have an elaborate error correction system, the DNA repair system, which if not invoked would lead to the formation of mutations or to the programmed cell death that I had illustrated earlier. Just one second. The machinery which ensures that the DNA remains free of errors, the DNA repair machinery, is critical to the cell. All living beings have it, and importantly, we have it in very many different forms. We don't have just one system which repairs DNA. We have several different ones which kind of work in tandem, in parallel with each other, and try to get the job done. If you have any problems with this machinery, however, you see that an organism or an individual who has defects in his DNA repair machinery tends to have reduced lifespan and or premature aging. Well-known examples of this I have kind of put here. They are Werner syndrome, Cockayne syndrome. Cockayne syndrome is also called progeria, means you grow old very young. The average age at which a person with Cockayne syndrome dies is 13 years, and he looks quite old, quite aged at the age of 13. And that is because the mechanism by which his DNA could be corrected has been corrupted. Another well-known and very common, relatively common condition is associated with the protein BRCA2, which is associated with breast cancer, and individuals, usually runs in families. Families which have this have very high probability of developing breast cancers. You'll notice that it's a probability always. The reason for this I had kind of shown at one point earlier when I showed you how different forms of adducts or carcinogens can have different effects in DNA. The same substance can be benign sometime, can turn carcinogenic some other time, The Russian roulette is what leads to this probability figures that we see in association with various data about cancer and so on. The repair machinery has a very neat way of taking care of the problem. Here I am illustrating this with the thymine dimer which I had shown you all. This thymine dimer is kind of pulled outward, and after it's pulled outward, the molecule, the protein wraps itself around it, examines it, makes sure that it is corrected. You can see that the action of the protein with relation to the DNA is that of grasping, so to speak. This is another example of a repair enzyme which is implicated in the very common disease in these climates, cyclic xeroderma pigmentosum. What seems to be happening is that the DNA is clasped by this protein molecule. It seems to hold it and wriggle out the damaged base, so to speak, just by the action of pressure. And once this damaged base is peeped out, an exonuclease action, which is an action which chops out the errant part of the DNA molecule, is undertaken, after which repair leads to the synthesis of a normal strand again. This is the human DNA polymerase eta. This is a very similar enzyme, only thing is it's from the bacterium Escherichia coli. E. coli is, let's say, as far removed from humans as you can get, but both of them share this particular repair enzyme, which has very similar mode of action and has a very similar mode of identifying lesions caused by UV light. So now, looking at the larger picture of how does a cell defend itself against damage from external environmental sources. One good way of doing such a thing would be compartmentation. That is, what you are doing is, instead of having everything mix up with everything, you try to put them into separate compartments, each one to handle one type of a job. This is a process which is kind of elaborated in evolution, and by the time you get to large forms like us, we have taken compartmentation to a much, much more refined extent. But here you can see that there are structures called peroxisomes, for example. The peroxisomes are bags which contain a very high concentration of enzymes which are involved in the process of detoxification. They take organic substances which have entered the cell and then convert them into forms which can be utilized by the cell or at least excreted from the cell. About 25% of all the alcohol that you drink ends up in the peroxisomes, which converts them to aldehydes and therefore begins the process of eliminating them from the body. Similarly, we have mitochondria which handle all the energy job. The example of the electron transport chain that I showed you happens inside the mitochondria. The nucleus is where you safely package away your DNA. All your genetic material is kept, and it is kept packed with molecules which at least to some extent prevent it from being approached by free radicals and so on. Chloroplasts, which are found only in plants and in some green algae and so on, are places where photons are put to use to produce to undertake photosynthesis, which is the way in which plants produce glucose. That's a nutritional function, genetic, engineer, energy, and detoxification. Another way in which cells can defend against damage from environmental sources is the disruption of free radical chain reactions. I had shown that, for example, in the Fenton reaction, once it starts going, you can keep getting more and more free radicals being formed. Antioxidants are what really can counter this. What antioxidants have is they have accessible electrons As you can see in the case of ascorbic acid, it has like OH here all sitting and waiting, which when exposed to a free radical will lead to the formation of two double bonded O's, which are quite stable, and a water molecule which is harmless. Another way in which we can ensure that the reactive oxygen species is removed is by scavenging functions of a certain class of enzymes, the antioxidant enzymes, examples of which are the catalase, which is found in the peroxisome, which takes the hydrogen peroxide, which I had said was a metastable form of oxygen. It's a strong reactant but not a free radical yet, and converts it into much more stable water and oxygen. Catalase is a substance which prevents food from oxidizing. People who do not have this enzyme or have a deficiency in this enzyme are predisposed to type 2 diabetes. The ability of human cells to make catalase efficiently decreases with age, and it is believed with strong evidence that the reduction of catalase activity in the hair follicle cells is what contributes to gray hair. This is interesting because another way in which you can get not gray but blonde hair is by using peroxide to give you the peroxide blonde. Gray hair also seems to have the same roots. Another antioxidant enzyme which I will describe here is superoxide dismutase. This takes a very strong radical, the superoxide radical, and converts it to hydrogen peroxide and oxygen. Superoxide radical is extremely dangerous because it's what really kind of creates the species which can damage DNA, the peroxynitriles and other similar species. Mice which lack superoxide dismutase show the kind of symptoms that I described earlier for the cocaine case of mutations, which is that they have early deaths also associated with the cataracts, liver carcinomas and so on. The interesting thing is that enzymes which have functions like this would have been considered to be very critical, and therefore any deficiency of those enzymes should not be tolerated by the system at all. It should not actually lead to a functioning organism. But as you can see, the operation of critical tasks is always allotted to redundant systems. That is, you have the same thing being done by several different enzymes or groups of enzymes. In the case of free radical scavenging, I've told you there's catalase, superoxide dismutase, it's also glutathione peroxidase. In the case of DNA repair, there's a huge array of repair enzymes, some of which have been in evolution from the very beginning. E. coli has 5 of them. Human beings have at least 12, maybe there are more as yet undiscovered ones, but that's the level of redundancy that you have in repair systems. Another way is to sequester metal ions. I had shown you with the Fenton reaction how you can lead to a chain reaction for the formation of free radicals. The Fenton reaction shows that iron in its free form is not a very pleasant thing to have around in a biological system. So the best thing you can do with it is to tie it up and keep it trapped in a way. The way that is done is that the metal ion is stored in a protein called ferritin. And ferritin is found largely in the red blood cells and also circulating all through your body. Hydroxyl radicals are which are produced by the Fenton reaction by the loose free floating ion are trapped by an enzyme called G6PD, glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase. G6PD is the committing step to the whole pathway which takes glucose and finally converts it into energy. And defects in this enzyme are easily the most commonly found defects in human beings. About 400 million people carry defective versions of this enzyme. How do 400 million people have it without any effect? Why is it that they have been kind of chosen to carry this enzyme? Can be seen from its very curious set of symptoms which are associated with a deficiency in G6PD. You have a tendency to have hemolytic anemia because, as I said, this process of iron trapping and so on is largely confined to the red blood cells. So hemolytic anemia is a common thing that you could encounter. You could have neonatal jaundice, but then you also have protection from malaria. What is happening is that when you don't have G6PD, your red blood cells tend to have high levels of hydroxyl radicals because there is no G6PD to scavenge those radicals, and the high levels of hydroxyl radicals kill any malarial parasite which is trying to get into the red blood cell. That gives you protection from malaria, and therefore 400 million people have kind of over a period of time inherited this deficiency because it also gives them an advantage. A large part of my talk was centered on effects that damaging agents have on DNA, but that is only because of restrictions of time. The examples of other substances which are damaged by environmental agents is large, and as just an illustration, we take the human eye lens. Human eye lens has to be transparent because light has to pass through it. To attain transparency, you cannot have blood vessels inside it, and in mature cells there can be no nucleus. This makes sure that they are transparent. Also, they need to be dense and elastic because they have the property of accommodation. You can focus, and that is brought about by a very high concentration of proteins. Now, if you have a tissue which is transparent, has a lot of electron-rich substance inside it, and has light passing through it. Light is electromagnetic radiation, as I had told. What would happen is that over time you would have the kind of reactions that I showed with DNA, the formation of thymine dimers. Here it is not thymine dimers, but you have amino acids or proteins, certain amino acids or proteins which break down over time. And these oxidative products remain in the lens and over time lead to cataract. This therefore makes the point that damage is all pervading. Now, how to live with this damage is something that we have adapted over years. Now we will talk in terms of how we can use what we have learned from the environmental effects on cells. As a beginner, here I am showing two examples. One is a molecule called doxorubicin. If you look at it carefully, it has a shape and structure which is not very different from what I had shown for benzoanthracene. And benzoanthracene can disrupt DNA. Doxorubicin also disrupts DNA. Only thing is it is selectively targeted to cancer cells, which is where it goes and has the effect of damaging their DNA and preventing them from growing further. That makes it a good chemotherapeutic agent. Similarly, for cisplatin, which is an atom of platinum trapped in some nitrogen ions, it acts in a way somewhat similar to what I had described for the Fenton reaction, how you generate radicals and so on, how you damage bases of DNA. That's what cisplatin's effect is, and makes it a very useful anti-cancer drug. Other ways of trying to use these effects, environmental effects on cells, is by the selective generation of oxidative stress. That is, you want to induce oxidative stress, but only in certain places, only in cancer cells as an example, though there are other diseases where they are used too. And one way is photodynamic therapy of cancer, where what you are doing is you are giving a substance which you know is going to produce hydroxyl radicals, but you are targeting it only to a certain set of subset of cells in the body where it will form hydroxyl radicals and therefore ensure destruction. The trade name of one compound being used for photodynamic therapy is porphymer, and what it does is it photosensitizes you. You inject it into a patient, give it 72 hours, over which time it kind of prevails only in normal cells but is removed from the rest of the body, and then you bombard it with light at a certain wavelength. The oxygen species which are produced will kill the cells in the vicinity of wherever this has localized. Make sure that you don't go in the sun for a few weeks after that because your body remains photosensitive. Side effects of this, good side effects from the view of what you are trying to do, include damage to blood vessels. Damage to blood vessels is a very nice way of preventing cancer cells from tumors from growing, because the tumors require a very large supply of blood for their growth. The limitations of using photodynamic therapy, as I've illustrated here, is that you can't shine light very deep into the body. There's only a limit up to which it can go. So you can either use it for tumors which are in the linings of your intestinal tract and so on, or you can use it on superficial tumors such as skin cancers and so on. To overcome this, you try to figure out ways in which you could take the principle of photodynamic therapy and convert it into a scale which could be used in tumors anywhere. One way is to take nanoparticles which contain a material which scintillates. Scintillator is a substance which absorbs light at or electromagnetic waves at one frequency and then emits at another frequency. A convenient would be an X-ray scintillator, which would take X-rays which can pass through your body and then emits at a wavelength which would be functional from the point of view of the photosensitizer. Using this combination, and if you could find a way of targeting the nanoparticles which have the scintillator and the photosensitizer only to the tumor cells that you want to destroy, you would have a very effective means of killing tumor cells. This has already happened, and these are right now being tried out in various places around the world. Other things include using these principles of targeting include radiosurgery, brachytherapy, where what you are trying to do is you are taking a particle which has the ability to generate X-rays and putting it inside cancer cells only. Cancer vaccines are helpful in making sure that you can target these particles only to the cancer cells and not to other parts of a system. Another example which I'll just quickly illustrate is the Cancer Genome Atlas project. This is how we are trying to use the power of modern technology of doing large-scale sequencing and applying it to what we have learned from our knowledge of environmental damage and so on. A particularly aggressive form of cancer is acute myeloid leukemia. It's considered easily the most threatening of all cancers, especially because what happens is when you try to prevent the first wave of leukemia cells by chemotherapy, you end up generating even more aggressive forms which only accelerate the rate at which there's a decline in the health of the patient. So what do you do with a disease like this? There is no clear single cause. It's not something that you can pinpoint and say there's one gene which has a defect and therefore you try to do something about it. What happens in the case of AML is that there's a much larger degree of breakdown of order in the cell. To try to understand what that is, the strategy that has been used recently, by recently I mean this work is about 6 months old, is that you take an individual with the AML who has not been treated with chemotherapy so far, take his genome and sequence it thoroughly, not just once, you sequence it over and over again, high degree of redundancy, so that you are not going to miss even one single change in the 6 billion base pairs that his genome has. This is a daunting task because for us to be sure of our results at this level is not easy. It's only achieved by doing things like sequencing this 6 billion so many times that you accumulate 116 base pairs of reading. Then you kind of statistically make sure that you have read each one correct over and over. And what all this produced was a single mutation, a frame shift mutation in one gene. This gene was a DNA methyltransferase. Again, a kind of enzyme which is involved in making sure DNA remains in a particular form. After you are fairly certain that it's one single defect, what you do is you kind of confirm it by sequencing several other patients who have the same disorder. Here you don't have to sequence the entire genome, which is a laborious and time-consuming job. What you do is you focus only on the regions which you are fairly certain is where the defect lies, and so do targeted DNA sequencing. What this enzyme does is that it adds a methyl group C to chains of DNA which have continuous runs of CG, 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 what are called CPG islands. And as I said, these islands are kind of places where DNA is locked up, and in the regions around here, the genes that are present are not expressed in very high level. Now, if you take the ml genomes of people with this mutation, you find that the absence of this or the defect in this enzyme has led to reduced methylation in 102 genomic regions. That's where the story lies now. You know that you are having this effect in a large number of places. What that effect is what you have to find out now. The closing message is, what do we make of all this in terms of our own lifestyles? Some people ask questions like, is there an age limit to human beings? Do we have a limit at all, or is there ways in which you could tailor your life, organize it such that you could live for maybe infinity? Not known. One very commonly propounded theory is called the caloric restriction theory, which says that eat less and you will do well. And its proponents say that, especially in people who have are growing older, it's simple. The lesser the food you take in, the lesser will be the amount of energy metabolized, the lesser will be the amount of free radicals generated in your systems, and therefore lesser will be the effect that those agents will have on your system. Sounds good, but then it's not very easy. Perhaps the most simple formula that can be advocated is to just go normal, healthy diet, physical activity, optimal weight, which translates in the cellular context into nutrition, energy, homeostasis. Thank you all.